The jet hummed like a giant insect as it cut through the night. Rafael Oliveira watched the world blink by beneath the cabin window, a scatter of lights, an ocean that had been a highway of decisions and deals for the last 3 weeks. Singapore had been a tidy victory, another acquisition folded into the network he had built with long hours, sharper edges, and an unrelenting calendar. He had closed that chapter from a hotel suite under neon and glass. The house in São Paulo, with its marble and old wooden frames, should be a sanctuary where the rest of him could breathe. The car ride from the private terminal was soft, with the kind of silence only a driver and a man who would rather not talk could make. The motorcade eased through gates that always opened at his approach. Marble halls swallowed the noise of the car's tires. Rafael stepped out, suitcase in hand, and felt the space of the house like a pressure change. Too quiet, as if someone had taken the sound out of the rooms and left them listening. Veronica Costa was waiting in the foyer, framed by the frosted glass of the stairwell landing, as if she had been painted there to greet him. She wore the same composed smile she used at charity galas and on camera, poised even, like a photograph you could always trust. The woman on those screens, Veronica the philanthropist, Veronica the gracious wife, moved with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to manage light. "Welcome home," she said, voice even, hands steady on the banister. The syllables were warm enough. The warmth was measured. He searched her face for fatigue or relief. He found, instead, a ready calm, the kind that suggested the household had been running smoothly in his absence. She stepped forward, a perfunctory kiss on his cheek, a hand on his forearm. "Where's Sophia?" Rafael asked without preamble. The house had an echo right then, an echo that made his voice sound like it belonged to a man in a hall twice his size. Veronica's fingers tightened for a fraction of a second, almost a reflex. And then she made her smile broader, as if erasing the slight hitch. She's resting. She had a little incident today, nothing to worry about. I was just about to put her to bed. You must be exhausted." "Show me," he said. The hallway to Sophia's room was perfumed with something clinical, the ghost of antiseptic and lemon oil, like a clinic pretending to be a home. Rafael noted the silence again. No sound of a child at play, no small chaos. A framed photograph on the console near the door, where Sophia's first day at kindergarten had once looked like a sunburst, now looked almost staged. He touched the frame as if expecting warmth. It was cool. Veronica opened the door with a practiced motion. The room inside was small and bright, painted a pale blue that had once soaked up crayons and fairy stories. Now it looked like a small island, polished for inspection. The toy chest was closed. A row of dolls stood in a tidy line. On the bed, wrapped in a blanket, a small figure curled around a teddy bear, Sophia. Rafael's breath caught before he reached the bed. Her face, turned away, had shadows under the eyes no 7-year-old should carry. What struck him first, the wrongness that alarmed more and more as his eyes searched, was not just the way she held the teddy, it was the shape of her head. Where her hair had always fallen like a thick curtain, where he had loved to feel the knot of it in his fingers, the smell of shampoo, there was an abrupt unevenness, stubble and exposed scalp in patches, the pattern of a hurried clipper. It looked like winter on a child who should be in spring. The sound of clippers echoed briefly in Rafael's memory, the rasp, the mechanical insistence, and then he remembered a smaller sound, a soft whimper pressed into a sentence. Sophia's voice, tiny and brittle, reached him from under the blanket. "She said it would make me behave," the child said. "She said I was stubborn." Rafael's legs went unsteady. The suitcase hit the floor with soft thud. The room narrowed around him. He put his hand on Sophia's shoulder with the clumsy tenderness of a man who had been away from ordinary fathering for too long. Her small body trembled beneath his palm. Bento, the teddy bear with one ear slightly frayed, was clutched to her chest as if it were the only thing ordained to stay. "Who did this to you?" he asked, voice thin and small in his own ears. Veronica's answer was a sort of rehearsed grammar. "I punished her for running away from her caregiver. She's been difficult, testing boundaries, Rafael. I thought a short haircut would help her understand." "She cut her hair," Rafael said. The words landed like stones. "It's for the best," Veronica said. Her voice had the iron clarity of someone committed to a narrative. "She'll be better behaved. You must understand. Children respond to consequences." Sophia pulled Bento up to her face, as if shielding the bear from the conversation. "He loves my hair," she said, very small. "Bento liked my hair." Rafael felt a hollow, as if something had been cut loose inside him and left a cold space where steadiness should be. Guilt arrived with a physical taste, bitter, metallic. He had been away. He had been building a future that would one day let him be present. The future had not made his absence any less a wound. He gathered Sophia into his arms. She fit small and fragile against the broadness of his chest. He felt the smallness of her, the way her legs curled around him, the press of Bento against his collarbone. He smelled her hair, what remained of it, and the faint lemon of the room. He felt Veronica's eyes like an accusation or a calculation. He could not tell which. "From now on," he said, words falling like a promise he wanted to keep. "From now on, I'm here." The promise was a temperature change. Sophia's breathing eased by a fraction. She pressed her face against his shirt and made a sound that was almost a laugh, damped by fear. Rafael held her and listened to the frantic clatter of his own heart find a slower rhythm. He left Sophia in a room that needed reclaiming. The bed smell, the scattered toys he would later let be, the way the light at the window seemed more yellow than it had when he'd left. On the landing, Veronica watched him with a look that might have been pity and might have been calculation. Rafael did what he always did when something broke. He began to assemble facts. He could not let feeling alone govern his next steps. He took a photograph with his phone, hands steady, a clinical succession of images, close shots of the scalp, the uneven line Bento held to her chest. He snapped the open toy chest. He took one of the laundry basket where a pair of clippers lay half covered by a towel. He did not yet touch anything. Veronica's explanation repeated itself. Stubbornness, discipline, a necessary lesson. "You were gone," she said softly, as if the invocation of his absence were a fact that justified everything. "Children need order." "Did you call me? Did you tell anyone?" Rafael asked. His voice was taut. "No," she admitted, the word curt, then smoothed again. "It happened this afternoon. She pulled at the curtains. She drew on the wall. It was a mistake to let it go on. I corrected it." The words were small vessels containing something bigger. They slid across each other like fragments of a broken mirror. Rafael felt the patient urge of someone trained to assume the best in people. They had married, he had trusted her. And yet there was an edge of something predatory in the gait of her certainty. He felt his distance from this household like a profession. His absence had been a lever. Her pulse of control had filled the space. He walked out of the room with Sophia's small hand in his. Down the corridor, he could feel the house breathe around them, quieting as if trying not to be noticed. He set her on the living room sofa and crouched before her. Her eyes were wet and raw, the scalp pink at the edges where hair had been shorn. "Do you want me to call someone?" he asked, thinking of doctors, of words that sounded appropriate and safe. Sophia's answer was a child's arithmetic of fear and trust. "I want Bento," she said. "I want Mama." She stopped, the word unfinished, as if Mama did not map cleanly to the two women who rotated through her life. Rafael pulled Bento from under the couch somewhere, a small triumph. The teddy was worn in the way of objects that had been loved and handled, a small, steady thing that knew the geography of the child. He handed Bento back and watched Sophia wrap her arms around it. He called Marcelo, his family lawyer, from the foyer. Marcelo's voice over the phone was practical, anchored. "Do not confront her," Marcelo said, without judgment, but with the authority of someone who had seen how these scenes could spin. "Document everything. Do not move evidence. Photograph. I'll come over. We'll talk to social services. If there is cause, we will file for immediate protective measures. I don't want to make it worse for Sophia," Rafael said, clutching the receiver with both hands. He could feel Veronica's presence in the house like a weather pattern he could not yet predict. "You have to protect her," Marcelo said simply. "We'll move fast." By the time Marcelo arrived, the house was a layer cake of small details, photographs lined up in folders, a record of timestamps on Rafael's phone, the clippers in a bag Marcelo would later submit as evidence. Marcelo walked the rooms with a steady eye, noting the things Rafael might have missed, a smear of paint on the baseboard that matched a page torn from a coloring book, the way the curtains bore a child's handprint, faint with chalk dust. He listened as Rafael recited the timeline. He asked gentle, practical questions about who had keys, who had been in the house that day, and what the nanny, Donna Lucia, might have observed. "I fired the nanny," Veronica said when Marcelo asked. The sentence was small but contained its own explanation. "She wasn't doing the job right. She left the door open. I did not fire her for that," Lucia said when Rafael called on the phone, voice trembling. She had been with the family for years. The line of loyalty in her voice was a rope that had been frayed, but not yet broken. "They called and said I had to leave. They told me I could not come back, but I came yesterday and Sophia was quieter. She cried and she tried to hide under the table. I could not do anything. Veronica told me to go home. She said it was none of my business." "You stayed away?" Rafael asked. "I left because they said I should," Lucia said. "But I can tell you this. She was different. She didn't smile the same. Her hair, it used to be so long. She liked having braids." Rafael put the phone down and felt the solitude of the man who had been summoned home by something that was not a merger, but an emergency. Marcelo's counsel was methodical. "We will contact social services," he said. "We will request a welfare check. We will ask Beatriz. She's reliable. We'll also consider surveillance footage and any cameras in the house. Do you have security logs?" Rafael nodded. The house had a private security system. Someone had recommended it the year he'd moved in. He had set it up with layers, perimeter cameras, motion sensors, a central console that logged activity. "Yes, I'll pull the logs. If there were any visitors, we'll see the timestamps." Marcelo's lawyer's face had the calm of a man who expected messy things to be ordered. "Don't speak to the press," he added. "Do not make statements. Let us prepare. We'll seek an emergency protective order. We will avoid a public confrontation until we have the facts in front of a judge." Before Marcelo could leave, Rafael called Beatriz from Municipal Social Services. The woman on the other end, Beatriz Santos, had the cadence of someone used to absorbing crises and reformatting them into packets of practical next steps. "We will send a team," she said. "We will interview Sophia with a child psychologist present. We will evaluate immediate safety. If there is reason to remove her from the home for her safety, we will recommend protective measures." Rafael repeated the photographs he had taken, the clippers, the oddness of Bento's brief disappearance earlier in the day, how Veronica had said Bento had been misplaced while she cleaned the room. Small coincidences became threads. Marcelo and Rafael agreed on a plan. Document, preserve, involve social services, and prepare for legal action if necessary. Marcelo advised against making dramatic moves that might provoke a public spectacle. "You'll have to show restraint in public," Marcelo said, "but inside you move decisively. Protect the child first." Meanwhile, the house that had once been a private sanctuary was already beginning to feel like a stage. Veronica, sensing the shift, began to manage light. She changed out of the dress she'd worn to greet Rafael into something softer and posted a photograph later that night, an image of herself in a pale blouse, holding a plate of soup, with a caption about family being a work in progress. Indeed, the post garnered the kind of sympathetic comments she had cultivated through years of careful curation. Friends, donors, volunteers, strangers who had been taught to trust the polished reflection. Rafael watched the post with a private discomfort. It felt like a smear already, an effort to shape the narrative so that the family drama would read as a minor domestic scuffle. He took screenshots. Marcelo advised gathering the digital trail. In his world, narrative could be both weapon and an obstacle. "They'll try to manage perception," Marcelo said. "Don't let them make your daughters experience something else." The decision to hire a private investigator felt like a step into a different register, from father to prosecutor. João Martins arrived the next morning, an ex-policeman who moved with the economy of someone who had spent years unspooling human patterns. He was not theatrical. He preferred small, deliberate actions. He carried with him a bag of tools, USB drives, a small portable audio recorder, and a talent for noticing what others saw as background. "We'll start with digital forensics," João said. "We'll pull the security logs. We'll speak to the nanny. We'll see if there are any internal cameras. We'll also look at Veronica's public footprints, her assistants, the charity calendar, anyone who might have been a witness to patterns." João's first nights were methodical. He sat with Rafael in front of the bank of security monitors and scrolled through an hour at a time, zooming into time-stamped frames that showed the comings and goings of the house. There was a frame at 14:12 showing Veronica moving through the living room with a small, angry set to her shoulders and Sophia trailing behind. Another at 14:32 showed the clippers on a towel on the bedroom armchair. João isolated a sequence near 15 in which Sophia approached a window and then recoiled, then in which Veronica's hands were in motion near the child's head. It was not an image of a crime, only of a fact. A child's hair shortened while an adult stood near. João found other details, a receipt from a hardware store for a pair of clippers bought 2 weeks prior, a message thread on a household tablet where a staff member had complained about being told to discourage certain behaviors. Each item knit together a pattern, not a verdict. Rafael printed the images, made notes with a pen that trembled slightly. Then came the press. Small accounts with an appetite for scandal sniffed for blood. Veronica's PR team, swift as a second skin, sent out statements. Family moment. Necessary correction. Private matter. Influencer friends posted supportive comments. The initial wave of social commentary split in two like water around rock. Those who sided with the public persona tended to trust the curated image. Others felt the abruptness of the photographs like a splinter. Tiago Almeida, an investigative journalist whose name Marcelo and João had traded in tight, fast sentences, reached out by email with an offer to meet. Tiago had a reputation for following threads rather than headlines. When he sat across from Rafael in the study, his notebook balanced on a knee, eyes curious but not hungry, he did not ask for a confession. He asked for documents and for the narrative of the man who had come home to a child with hair gone. "There's something in public and something in private," Tiago said. "People can be very good at living in both. They build an image and invest in it. It's not about hating the image. It's about finding out if what's being done privately lines up. You have to understand, if we publish too soon, we can create a scandal that makes your daughter a target. If we wait, we lose momentum." Rafael listened and thought of Bento, of a child whose agency had been clipped along with hair, literalized into a visible thing. He wanted the world to know that his child had been harmed, but he also wanted the world to stop for a minute and acknowledge what it meant to be 7 and scared. "Can you find precedent?" Rafael asked. Has Veronica, do you see a pattern?" Tiago's fingers tapped his notebook. Sometimes these patterns are public and sometimes they're paper thin, he said. There are donations, there are boards, there are assistants who move on. But if a pattern emerges, if we can corroborate testimony from former staffers, financial anomalies that suggest power play, it becomes clearer. As evidence was assembled, the house became a calculus. Receipts, messages, CCTV stills, a statement from a nanny who had been fired, the small trinkets of domestic life that bore witness, all collected like fossil fragments. Each of them was tender, raw, a small thing that could be interpolated into a larger picture only with care and legal prudence. Marcelo warned against public leaks that could complicate court filings. João cautioned about chain of custody with evidence. Tiago weighed the public interest against potential harm. At night, Rafael found himself awake in the master suite. The city lights smeared glassy over the skyline. He would go to Sophia's room often, like someone recalibrating himself to love. He learned the topography of her sleep, the way her breath hitched at dreams, how bento always landed on the left side of her chest, how the tiny ponytail she insisted on for some days could be coaxed back as she chose later on. He rehearsed conversation with himself about presence, about the work that would make up his own redemption. A week after his return, the first tangible legal move was made. Marcelo filed for immediate protective measures, a petition built on documentation and on testimony from the Nanny and Social Services initial report that had included a child psychologist's preliminary evaluation. The filing asked for temporary custody to be placed with Rafael, pending a preliminary hearing. It was a procedural move, one that would suspend Veronica's unilateral decision-making while a court considered the evidence. The filing created its own weather. Veronica's team, trained in the choreography of image control, framed the petition as an impulsive move by a father unready to accept disciplinary measures. A staged photograph of Veronica at a community shelter, arm about an elderly volunteer, a soft smile, appeared on her social channels within hours. Supporters flooded the comment sections with assurances about her charity work. Selective clips of her volunteering in orphanages circled through the networks. For every image of a shaved head and a child clinging to a teddy, there was a counter-image. Veronica at ribbon cuttings, Veronica framing children at a donation event, Veronica the woman who had raised funds for schools. Rafael watched the public narrative like a second wound. It did not touch him physically, but it cut at the edges of the story he wanted told. He knew the world loved neat binaries, villain and victim, sinner and saint. The truth he carried did not want the comfort of two poles. It was messy and required pages of contextualization. Public perception is part of the battleground, Marcelo noted. But don't engage with the trolls. Let the court be the arbiter of facts. You'll be painted either way. The issue is whether you can prove what you claim. Proof was a patient animal. João continued to gather it. He found over the course of his weeks more than a daytime incident. He discovered emails between Veronica and an assistant ordering a narrative be prepared in case of family disturbances. He tracked payments from the household account to an organization Veronica had used for image management. He found a former assistant, choked and cautious, who described how Veronica had organized corrections for staff and children she deemed brittle or unsatisfactory, using language that suggested selection and normalization of control. The journalist Tiago, meanwhile, delved into archives and found instances where Veronica's charity had been accompanied by stinging departures, staffers who left after being pushed out, volunteers who spoke of a tight household that enforced behavior more than it nurtured it. Tiago's notes were not convictions, but they were a map of a personality that prized the scripted image. When word of the protective order filing leaked, likely through an assistant who panicked, the public reaction bifurcated, as it had already begun to, the sympathetic and the skeptical. Veronica took to interviews, her tone practiced and wounded. She spoke of being a mother who sought to maintain standards. "Children test limits," she said on a morning show, eyes glossy with contrived hurt. "You do what you must to teach them." The words did not stand still in the air. They slid into social media feeds and turned into arguments. Some callers defended her energy, some accused her of cruelty. Rafael felt the house contract again under the weight of other people's opinions. Investors, always a second family to a CEO, began to message with the fast formality of concern. A board member asked for assurances that the company's reputation would not be damaged. "Handle it," someone said in a private message, an ellipsis of expectation. Rafael responded with an email that was at once apologetic and immovable. His child was his first duty. Everything else would wait. The preliminary hearing date arrived like a knot that needed untangling. Marcelo prepared a file thick with images and transcripts. Dr. Helena Moreira, a child psychologist who specialized in play therapy and child interviews, reviewed Sofia's case and agreed to conduct an interview for court per the municipality's guidelines, an effort to allow Sofia to speak safely to an impartial figure. The municipal social worker Beatrice filed her own observations, describing an environment of inconsistency and a child who had been frightened. João prepared a timeline and backed up every video clip with metadata. Tiago prepared a longer piece but held it, to protect Sofia's privacy until more facts were established. The day before the hearing, Rafael took Sofia to a small park behind the house. It was mid-afternoon, and the sun turned leaves a forgiving gold. They sat on a bench. Sofia hesitated at the edge of playing, the way a child measures safety with a glance. She touched her head without a question, as if learning the new geography. "Do you want to cut it?" Rafael asked gently, remembering the motif of hair and agency that had threaded itself through every day since his return. Sofia looked at him with a gravity that startled him. "I want to cut it when I want," she said. "Not because someone said I was bad." He nodded. The sentence settled like a small victory. She was reclaiming a piece of herself, the right to choose when to alter how she looked. Then she stood and ran toward a swing, cautious but intent. Rafael watched her move and felt the ache of all he could not undo. That night, as files were printed and evidence boxed, as Marcelo outlined steps and João, balanced the practicalities of cameras and custody, Rafael sat at his desk and wrote a list of small rituals he would keep. Bedtime stories read aloud until she was asleep, a breakfast routine, school drop-offs that replaced months of missed mornings. He committed, in ink, to being available. It felt like a new contract, different from the legal documents that sat in neat stacks on his table. This was private and more binding. Outside, the world murmured. Veronica's PR team placed op-eds. A small leak surfaced with an insinuation that Rafael had been negligent, that he had not been present enough to parent. Trolls wrote that wealth buys distraction. Rafael deleted some of the messages before they could burn his own inbox. He did not want to be diverted by smoke. He wanted a clear path to keep his daughter safe. On the morning of the hearing, the house felt both hollow and braced. Photographs of the family with smiles looked like props in a museum exhibit of what had been lost. Marcelo collected his papers. João had a digital folder ready to submit. Dr. Helena carried a folder with notes about child-appropriate interview techniques. Beatrice joined their group with quiet competence. As Rafael drove to the courthouse, with Sofia secure in the back seat, clutching bento in a way that had become a compass for her, he tried to imagine the mechanics of a justice that felt just. He imagined the judge reading a stack of documents and neutrally striking a line for protection. He knew the law could offer temporary shelter, a breathing space in which they could reconstruct the house as something safe. He also knew the law was a machine that turned slowly and required patience and proof. The courthouse loomed with the bland authority of civic architecture. People milled about, press vans parked across the street, an umbrella of camera equipment, a few sympathetic faces that might be friends or might be just weather. For Rafael, each public step was a test of how to be a father in the view of others without letting that view define the interior life of his child. Inside the courtroom, the air was cooler. A bailiff directed them to a small waiting area where Sophia drew with a crayon set Marcelo had brought for her. She drew a house with a garden and a swing, a small stick figure with hair that reached her shoulders. Rafael watched, each stroke a small healing. Marcelo's voice whispered instructions. Let the facts speak. Allow the psychologist to be the conduit for the child's voice. Do not let the press into the private moments. When the judge called the case, Rafael could feel the tilt of bureaucracy against the raw edge of their family. Veronica's counsel arrived with a tide of composed confidence, an image of rectitude. Her presence in court was the personification of a life run through careful optics, calm, deliberate, technically unshaken. The hearing itself took place in a compact, procedural rhythm. Marcelo presented the photographs, the security stills, the social services preliminary report, and Dr. Helena's initial impressions. He requested temporary custody and an order limiting Veronica's unsupervised access to Sophia until a fuller hearing could evaluate the evidence. Veronica's counsel countered, arguing that what had occurred was an isolated disciplinary act, asking for time to present exculpatory context. He raised technical points about chain of custody for the clippers and custody of photographs, and the way evidence was collected, standard defense maneuvers meant to cast doubt. The judge listened with a face that did not give away judgment. The law, Rafael realized, would not be moved by rhetoric alone. It would require the steadiness of procedure, the insistence of corroborated facts. The judge looked at the child's drawings, at the social worker's report, at the video stills. The gavel that issued the judge's words felt like an instrument that leveled the room. Given the reports and the submission of initial corroborative evidence, the judge said, I will grant provisional protective measures pending a full evidentiary hearing. Temporary custody will be placed with the petitioner, Mr. Rafael Oliveira, until such time as the court can consider further evidence. The relief was palpable and immediate, not a triumph, but a space to breathe. For Rafael, it felt like the hinge on which the next months would turn. There were still arguments to be made, reputations to be contested, and a longer story to be told. He understood the ruling as a necessary pause, a legal containment of what had been uncontained. Sophia clapped her hands once, softly, as if applauding the sense of being chosen again. Outside the courthouse, the cameras found them. Veronica's press coordinator spit out statements about ongoing family differences, and a barrage of commentators took their positions. Tiago watched the press scrum, notebook ready. He sought nuance. The difference between appearance and action, the documentation that made a pattern visible. João watched too, eyes scanning the press for undertones and for the next angle that would be used to pitch stories. Back at the house, life did not snap back into place with the ease of a switch. It was more like rewiring a delicate machine. Marcelo advised caution. Do not make statements. Coordinate with the child psychologist. Maintain routines. João suggested discreet measures to ensure safety, from changing locks to installing additional internal cameras where legal. Dr. Helena scheduled play therapy sessions. Beatriz arranged for a municipal support worker to check in regularly. The media storm, however, had only just begun to churn. Veronica's social networks doubled down on a narrative of a temporary misunderstanding, a phrase crafted to slide into feeds and be swallowed. Anonymous commentators called into talk shows. Papers with red headers speculated on drama and power. The house that had been a shelter now smelled sometimes of bleach and of the metaphoric scent of public scrutiny. Rafael found his days filled with the minutiae of protective parenting: breakfast, school meetings, therapy sessions. At night, he read to Sophia until her breath slowed, and the small rise and fall of her chest became the measure of his own peace. He learned to be there for the small things, tying shoes, standing by the bicycle as she tried again and again, and to let the public pronouncements be handled by counsel and by time. But even as he turned toward presence, he could not ignore the pattern that João and Tiago were mapping. Small administrative irregularities, a string of staff departures, an assistant's note that mentioned image over compassion. Each corroboration was a pebble tossed into a pond, ripples spread. One night, late, Rafael watched an old video on his phone. Sophia at a little play corner, hair braided, laughing as she fed a plastic tea set to Bento. He traced the smallness of the hand in the screen, the way she had tilted the teddy's head as if in conversation. He turned off the phone and pressed his forehead to the living room table. The fight ahead would not be won by a single photograph or an isolated ruling. It would be a slow, relentless assembly of facts, of therapy, of rituals that rerouted a child's sense of safety. He stood and walked to Sophia's room. She slept with Bento curled on top of the blanket. For a long moment, he watched the soft contours of her face and felt the weary kind of gratitude that had nothing to do with money or influence. Gratitude for the small breath of a sleeping child, for the chance to reschedule his life around a person who called him Papa. In the following days, as evidence continued to be gathered and the first hearing scheduled for broader proceedings, Rafael received a message from Tiago. "There's more," the journalist wrote simply. "I found a pattern of speeches, a list of donors lined up for image-building campaigns, and I'm talking to an ex-assistant who might be willing to speak. We need to talk about timing." Rafael exhaled. He felt the house again as if from the outside, a stage, a palace, a domestic geography that was being remade into a courtroom of public opinion. He would need to be steady, immovable when necessary, gently insistent at other times. He would need to be the reliable fixture in a small life that had been shaken. He thought of what presence would mean in the particular geometry of his days: fewer flights, earlier bedtime stories, being the one to pick her up from school so she would not learn to trust strangers over the familiar. He promised himself one more thing. This fight would not end in spectacle. It would be an exercise in slow reconstruction, in scaffolded safety. Beyond the house, the rumor mills kept working. Veronica appeared at a fundraiser with cameras present. She gave a soft statement about family privacy. An op-ed that favored her view circulated in a popular paper. Rafael read without comment. Marcelo kept him focused on the document trail. João expanded his search to financial records related to certain charities and to a string of contracts that appeared to funnel influence into image management. Sophia, meanwhile, began to draw more frequently. Her pictures moved slowly from jagged lines to more confident strokes. A sun, a figure with long hair, a swing. Her therapist noticed small changes: the way she initiated play, the way she refused certain topics. Dr. Helena worked with her through play therapy, giving her language about agency and choice, and creating a space where she could retell moments through puppets and drawings, instead of words that might re-traumatize. One afternoon, while Rafael was on a call with Tiago about possible timelines for publication, a stack of messages arrived on his phone: investors, managers, friends. The press was a slow hunger. It wanted to define the shape of their story. Rafael tapped a short response to the investor who had inquired, "We're handling a family matter. My focus is on Sophia." He added, "No further comment." He closed his eyes and felt the fatigue of a man learning to shift the center of gravity in his life. A new list had been scribbled in his notebook: protective measures, legal filings, therapy sessions, rituals of presence. Beneath the items, another note, in a different hand, had the words he had said to Sophia the night he returned. "I'm here." As the first part of this long, complicated choreography unfolded, discovery, documentation, a tentative legal win, the mounting tug-of-war in public opinion, Rafael realized that the real work had begun not in courtrooms, but in the small spaces where trust could be rebuilt, at a bedside, at a park, at a kitchen table over a bowl of cereal. The world could shout its opinions, could craft narratives, could assemble counter-images. He could not stop it. But he could stand in the middle of it and hold the child who had been entrusted to him. And he could, with patient persistence, stitch a life back together around the truth that every small person deserved. The right to choose, the right to be safe, the right to keep their teddy tucked to their chest. Outside, a press van idled like a beast of burden, waiting for a horn to sound. Inside the house, Bento rested in a place of honor on a new shelf, a small talisman. Rafael tucked a photograph of Sophia's drawing into his wallet. He would take it with him into hearings and into strategy sessions, into the quiet mornings he promised to spend at home. He knew the next steps would require strategy, evidence, and public patience. He also knew something quieter had already happened. The promise kept when he said in a moment of brokenness and resolve, "I'm here." Tiago's article landed like a measured stone in a still pond. He had waited, carefully, until João's forensics were catalogued, until Marcelo had prepared a court-ready chronology, until Beatrice and Dr. Helena had agreed that a public disclosure could be calibrated to protect Sophia. The piece did not scream. It read like a careful excavation. Timestamps, receipts, corroborated accounts from a former assistant who spoke on condition of anonymity, redacted snippets of messages that showed the house operated according to a rigid script, and an overlay of images that juxtaposed Veronica's public smiling face with private security stills, showing the child's head bowed in a way that suggested retreat rather than mischief. The reaction was not instantaneous fury, it was a gradual rebalancing. Some of Veronica's earlier defenders blinked and moved on. The charitable boards that had listed her as a figurehead began to call staff meetings. Donations that had once been automatic needed new approvals. A few influential voices, people who had admired her work at ribbon cuttings, asked pointed questions in private. On social platforms, the tide shifted from reflexive defense to guarded curiosity. The cable shows that thrived on uproar found their fodder elsewhere. Tiago's piece had been careful enough to avoid spectacle, but substantive enough to give others permission to look more closely. Rafael read the article in a quiet office that still smelled faintly of printer ink and night air. He felt the strain of weeks, like an ache in his jaw. He thought of Sophia at the table with crayons, of Bento's ear, of the small, stubborn way she insisted that hair be hers, to give only when she wanted. He kept thinking of that moment, opening the bedroom door, the rasp of clippers in his memory, and of the promise he had made with both the bluntness and tenderness of a man who had been absent too often. "I'm here. If this story is striking you, leave a comment telling where you're watching from. Small notes like that remind him there are people who care." With the journalist's piece circulating and João's dossiers growing, Marcelo urged steady timing. "We'll use the public momentum if it helps, but the court will decide on the evidence," he said. He explained the next legal maneuvers. A fuller evidentiary hearing would require more than photographs. They needed witness statements under oath, meticulous chain of custody documentation for any digital files, and clinical testimony from professionals who had spoken with Sophia in child-appropriate settings. João's work expanded. He located an email chain in which an assistant had documented a household meeting where Veronica outlined routines and corrective measures that would be applied to difficult children. João found a set of receipts showing purchases consistent with that narrative, multiple kits of grooming tools over a month, a small cash withdrawal pattern that corresponded with payments to a private assistant who later left abruptly. He compiled these artifacts into time-stamped files, each printed and double-backed up to multiple USB drives with verifiable metadata. Marcelo's voice on the phone was always the same. Keep originals untouched. Accompany everything with sworn statements. Create redundancy so the defense cannot plausibly argue tampering. An unexpected witness emerged in João's work, Camila, a former house assistant who had left months earlier and who trembled when she spoke at the cafe where João met her. She told a story of a household run by rehearsed routines and quiet threats, of staff told to curtail affection, of a woman who measured people's loyalty by their willingness to be tidy and discreet. Camilla's voice broke when she mentioned the word discipline, the one Veronica used to justify the haircut. "I saw her make a list," Camilla said, hands wrapped around a coffee cup. "Names, behaviors, who would be given second chances. She had rules, and anyone who didn't fit was adjusted." Her testimony could not be raw theatrics. It had to be corroborated. João cross-checked employment records, found a resignation letter from a caretaker with an odd signature, and traced a WhatsApp thread in which an assistant asked if it was right to discipline the child that way. Camilla agreed to give a formal statement under oath. Marcelo arranged the logistics. The defense would try to paint her as disgruntled, but prepared evidence of her long service and the abrupt conditions under which she departed. Veronica's response was legal and rhetorical. Her counsel, well-practiced and precise, filed motions to suppress certain materials, questioned the provenance of audio clips and the admissibility of private security footage. They argued, in court filings, that some of the material had been gathered without explicit consent and that the chain of custody could be challenged. The press made much of procedural ballet, who had done what and when, and for a while the argument diverted attention from the human center of the case. Marcelo anticipated each move. He produced logs from the security company showing authorized accesses, affidavits from technicians who had pulled data without altering files, and an internal memo confirming that the household owner, Rafael, had lawful custody of the recordings from the home system. The day of the evidentiary hearing felt different from the earlier preliminary session. It was longer, more exacting, and threaded with a quiet gravity that made everyone move with caution. The courtroom sat a bit fuller. A few reporters came, but were kept at a respectful distance. Dr. Helena's testimony had been scheduled to come later in the day. Marcelo began by laying out the factual timeline: the haircut, the photographs, the clippers found in the bedroom, the fired nanny's contact who had been prevented from returning, the missing days in which staff had been asked to leave, the suspicious purchases, the email chains. He introduced João as a fact witness who could explain how the digital files were preserved. The defense attacked method. "How do we know these files weren't edited?" one lawyer asked, voice formal and cool. "How can we be sure of the authenticity of a still frame without a continuous feed?" Marcelo answered calmly. He brought in a cybersecurity expert João had engaged, short, direct and meticulous, who explained metadata, hash values, the unbroken chain linking the time-stamped footage to the security server. The expert's testimony was technical and quiet, and it unspooled precisely the kind of explanation that would reassure a judge who had to decide whether to let the evidence be considered. The technicalities were tedious for the public, but essential for the judge. Law moved through procedure, and the defense's motions were the standard maneuvers in the dance of contesting a narrative. The judge listened, asked pointed questions about where backups had been stored and how witness statements were obtained. Marcelo's answers were precise by necessity. Emotion, he knew, could be helpful in a private setting, but in the courtroom the facts needed cold anchoring. When Dr. Helena finally took the stand, she did not recount trauma with drama. She spoke of method and of the weight of small details. She described the child-appropriate interview she had conducted with Sophia, The way Sophia had been invited to choose puppets, the manner in which she was asked to tell stories about a figure who might be a brave little girl, and the puppet's treatment. The way Sophia drew a sequence of images that, in professional terms, suggested anxiety around an authoritative figure and a preference for the safety of certain objects, like bento. She did not use the adult terms to describe what happened, Dr. Helena explained. Children often depict experience through symbol. In play, the character who used a sharp tool, a cutter, was depicted as making others small. The child expressed fear and a desire for autonomy. She consistently said she wanted to decide about her hair later, indicating an awareness of agency. The defense questioned the interpretation. The judge reminded everyone that such testimony is expert evidence. It does not constitute a factual verdict, but informs the court about the child's state. Carefully, the judge balanced the medical interpretation with the physical evidence. The photographs, the audio clips, the assistant's sworn account, and the social worker's observations coalesced. The cumulative weight mattered. At a tense moment, the defense made a strategy that pulsed through the room with a hard edge. They called for a forensic reanalysis of Joanne's files and suggested a potential breach when a junior technician who had accessed the server had left a morning earlier than listed. Marcelo anticipated that. He had arranged for the original technician to testify and to show an audit trail from the security company. The exchange was detailed, but the upshot was the same. The court accepted the chain of custody as credible. The judge accepted most of the evidence while limiting some materials that had not met evidentiary standards. A small but decisive scene occurred off-script, behind the closed doors of the courthouse hallway after the day's testimony. Camilla, the former assistant, agreed to speak on the record to a small legal reporter who had requested an interview. She named an incident in which Veronica had ordered staff to correct a child who had spilled juice at a charity event, and how the child had been made to stand in the sun without shade. The reporter's piece did not make sensational claims. It simply laid out that multiple staff members had independent stories that, while not criminal by themselves, formed a pattern of authoritarian control with little room for compassion. Such patterns mattered in court because they suggested motive and context. When the judge issued the interim ruling, the language was measured. The court extended the protective measures, noting that the cumulative evidence raised sufficient concern for the child's immediate welfare to justify limiting Veronica's unsupervised time with Sophia pending a fuller trial. The ruling was, once again, not the end. It was a legal breathing space. For Rafael, it felt like one more hinge opened, not justice complete, but the space to rebuild. Veronica's public image frayed. Boards invited independent audits. A few high-profile friends distanced themselves, saying that they had been unaware of the fuller picture. Veronica's social posts reduced in frequency, curated now with more restraint. Her lawyers filed responses, but the practical consequences accumulated. Sponsorships reviewed, invitations rescinded, once automatic support put on hold until inquiries concluded. The public, which had once embraced her as a face of good works, began to ask new questions. The law would not determine reputational fate overnight, but the cumulative light of scrutiny altered the script she had written for herself. Behind closed doors, Rafael returned to the more intimate work of healing. The rhythm of the house changed. He cut flights, rearranged calendars, learned to let another person's schedule be the priority. He was present at morning circles, at small injuries, at homework sessions, things that had once been delegated. The change was practical and ritualistic. He created a bedtime ceremony. A short walk to the window to look at the city lights, a reading aloud of a story they chose together, a soft, three-word line he said each night before tucking Sophia in. "I am here." He said it as a promise and as a fact. Dr. Helena's early therapy sessions focused on rebuilding control and language. In play therapy, children often reclaim agency through choices in a controlled, safe setting. Sophia was given choices: what color marker she would use, which puppet to take on an imaginary outing. Dr. Helena used narrative play. Sophia was encouraged to tell stories where a character faced a small problem and chose a solution. Through these stories, Sophia gradually articulated fear and resilience without needing to name a single harrowing detail. One significant technique Dr. Helena used was the choice tree, a laminated board showing options for small decisions, choosing what to wear, when to have a haircut, who may hug or say goodnight. Each choice had a simple, clear icon, and Sophia would move a token as her decision. On one afternoon, the therapist suggested, gently, that when Sophia felt ready, she could pick a new haircut herself. Sophia looked at the tokens, then at Bento, then at Rafael. Her eyes said what words did not. She nodded softly. It was a small reclaiming. The household underwent physical changes too. João recommended a few discreet safety upgrades: a movement sensor in certain corridors, a change of locks that was legal and straightforward, and an additional security monitor linked to Rafael's phone. Marcelo assisted with the paperwork. The court had allowed certain limitations on Veronica's access, and the legal team ensured that those boundaries were clear and enforceable. Publicly, Rafael kept his voice measured. He declined extended interviews, citing privacy. Tiago's reporting had been balanced, and he published one follow-up that focused on process and reform rather than spectacle. An examination of how image-driven charity work can create environments where accountability is hard to maintain. The piece included perspectives from social workers and child advocates who underscored how institutional checks can sometimes fail when personality fills gaps. The net effect was to shift the conversation from who to what systems were in place, and how could they be strengthened. Months flowed by with a kind of patient sameness. There were court dates and deposition sessions. There were times Rafael felt like the case was the axis of his days, and other times when it receded into the practical calendar of school plays and piano lessons. He learned to find equilibrium. Board members at his company accepted his decision to restrict travel. Investors, some of whom had initially worried about distraction, now saw a CEO whose priorities had clarified. A few suggested ways he might channel resources without courting further scandal: fund training programs for childcare staff, donate to municipal centers, sponsor a public campaign about the importance of reporting suspected abuse. Rafael listened to each proposal with the quiet attention of someone who had discovered how public goods can be aligned with private healing. Finally, the full evidentiary hearing arrived. It was longer and denser than prior sessions, with testimony layered and repeated as the legal teams moved through the required items. Marcelo presented the forensic chain, Camilla's sworn testimony, João's timeline, the security footage with careful annotation, and Dr. Helena's professional evaluation that emphasized the child's need for a stable environment. Beatriz, representing social services, read from her records and recommended that the child's primary caregiver be someone capable of consistent presence and whose household had systems to ensure safety. Defense counsel argued for a different way, that the haircut was an isolated, misguided disciplinary act in a household that otherwise provided structure, that the public persona should count for something, that children sometimes overstate events under stress. They tried to frame the matter as an overreaction to a single day's incident. The judge listened. The decision was not a dramatic proclamation. Legal outcomes rarely are. But after reviewing the compendium of evidence, documented pattern of staff departures, corroborating emails, receipts, the assistant's testimony, the security footage corroborating the timeline, and the expert testimony regarding Sophia's psychological state, The court issued a carefully worded judgment. The judge emphasized the child's best interests as the primary legal standard, and noted that the cumulative evidence had shown a persistent risk when the child was left in the sole care of the stepmother without professional oversight. In a ruling that balanced restraint with clarity, the court awarded permanent custody to Rafael, while granting Veronica supervised visitation rights to be arranged through a municipality-supervised program, contingent on demonstrated compliance with a series of conditions, counseling, parenting classes, and oversight. The ruling did not criminalize a single act. It did not declare Veronica a monster. It recognized a legal reality. Custody decisions must serve the child's welfare, and the accumulated facts persuaded the court that long-term residence with the parent who provided continual, stable care was in Sofia's best interest. The judge's decision reflected the narrow focus of family law. What would help this child grow secure? For Rafael, the decision brought a fatigue-tinged relief. He hugged Sofia when they returned home, as he had hugged her the night he walked in and found her shorn head under a throw. This time, the hug was not a starting point, but a continuation of the ritual of presence he had been building. He carried Bento like a talisman and helped Sofia place the bear in the new spot by her pillow that they had picked together. In the months that followed, the family, meaning Rafael and Sofia, bolstered by the measured support of professionals, settled into a new rhythm. Raf's life was still public by virtue of his work, but his private life had become organized around Sofia's small needs. He stopped taking long overseas trips. He instituted a simple rule: no meetings before his daughter's school drop-off. He began going to parent-teacher conferences as a matter of course rather than an exception. He learned the satisfaction of ordinary things, packing a lunch with a note scrawled in a hand that had once been hurried and distant, waiting at the school gate for a child to bound up with stories of sandbox conquests. Sofia's therapy progressed in ways that were not linear but cumulatively hopeful. In one session, she created a sequence of drawings showing a small girl who lost hair, and then drew a scene where the girl chose a new haircut at a salon, smiling. Dr. Helena called it symbolic agency. The child was reasserting control through play and imagined futures. In another session, Sofia asked to play with a new set of dolls that had diverse hair types and colors. She spent an hour styling them, braiding, brushing, creating ponytails. It was the kind of quiet reparation that spoke of a restoration of a sense of bodily autonomy. Rafael supported this by giving Sofia choices. On a sunlit Saturday, he took her to a small, child-friendly salon. She sat in a big chair with Bento beside her, and after a careful, patient conversation with the stylist, she chose a shoulder-length bob with a soft fringe, shorter than before but selected by her. As the hair fell away, the expression that crossed her face was careful, and then, slowly, a small thrill. She had cut it because she wanted to, not because someone had decided she should. The act was both symbolic and ordinary, and Rafael felt something loosen inside him, a knot that had not quite been frayed by paperwork or courtrooms. The public world continued its orbit. Veronica retreated from public life. Some committees removed her from honorary positions pending further internal reviews. Others severed ties. She complied in part with the court's conditions, attending a parenting course under judicial supervision and a municipal counseling program. The legal system had not pursued criminal charges. That path was distinct and required a different threshold. But in reputational terms, the veneer she relied upon had cracked, and with that crack came consequences. Fewer invitations, less deference, fewer unquestioning supporters. Rafael's response to the ordeal did not end with custody. The experience had sharpened a sense of responsibility that felt almost professional in its clarity. He had resources and he had access. He set about using both in practical, focused ways. He funded a local initiative to train childcare staff in recognizing and reporting suspected abuse, working with municipal social services to create a curriculum that emphasized documentation and safe reporting channels. He supported a small grant program that provided legal aid to parents who lacked resources to protect their children. He did not name a foundation after himself. He preferred to fund through existing channels and to underwrite pilot programs that could be scaled. Tiago's later feature noted that Rafael had turned personal grief into systems building, not as a publicity act, but as a quiet allocation of time and money to strengthen the mechanisms that had once been slow to act. The change did not erase scars. Sophia would sometimes ask out of the blue about the day her hair was cut, or she would avoid certain conversations that triggered an unsettled feeling. Dr. Helena guided Rafael in how to respond: brief reassurance, validation, and stepping back when the child needed space. They adopted rituals, a safe word, for when Sophia felt overwhelmed, a nightly check-in where she could say a word about her day, and an annual gratitude day, when they marked resilience with a small gathering of close friends and family who had been supportive, people who had proven themselves present in ways that mattered. Years later, the house looked warmer. The paint in Sophia's room changed from antiseptic blue to a gentle butter yellow they had chosen together. Bento still sat on a shelf, a little patched at the seam. Rafael framed one of the drawings that had been used as evidence, a child's stick-figure house with a sun and a person with long hair, and hung it in his office, not as a trophy but as a reminder of priorities. At night, when work emails were fewer and the city lights smeared like constellations, he would look at the drawing and remember the promise he'd made the night he returned. "I'm here." A time skip, small and tender. Sophia at 9, seated on a low stage in a community center, reading a short paragraph she had written about courage. She spoke plainly, with the clarity of a child who had learned to trust her voice. "Sometimes things happen that make you feel small," she read. "But there are people who help you get bigger again. My papa held my hand." The audience, neighbors, some teachers, a few journalists, applauded in a soft way that felt protective rather than voyeuristic. Rafael watched from the side. He felt the usual private blending of pride and vigilance. He had learned over the months and years since that first night to let presence be the measure of fatherhood. He had also learned to make that presence visible in modest, practical ways. A school lunch he had packed that morning, the way he'd learned the names of her friends, the ritual of tucking the bedhead back into place when she slept. He used his influence not for headlines, but for quiet systems work, funding training for municipal social workers, supporting a hotline that anonymized tips, sponsoring child-friendly interview spaces where judges and psychologists could meet children without fear of re-traumatization. There were still scars, small sensory triggers in the house that required attention, and there were questions without easy answers. Veronica's life settled into a quieter orbit. Some doors closed that could not be reopened. For Rafael and Sophia, healing was not a dramatic arc to a perfect finish, but a succession of small rituals. Meals eaten together, bedtime stories ended with the familiar cadence of "I am here," the selection of a haircut made in agency that accrued into a quieter confidence. The final scene was intimate and ordinary. It was a weekday afternoon. The sun slanted in a warm, late angle over the living room. Sophia sat cross-legged on the rug with a fresh box of crayons. She drew a sequence: a small house, a child with hair flowing, a child with short hair, and finally a child with a big smile. Rafael sat beside her, the photo of her kindergarten day folded in his shirt pocket and Bento leaning against his knee. She looked up at him with that frankness children have and asked, "Do you remember the first night you came home?" He nodded. The memory was precise: the rasp of clippers, the smell of lemon oil, the weight of Bento against a small chest. He remembered the promise too, the 3-word contract that had rewritten his life. "Were you scared?" she asked. "Yes," he said truthfully. "I was. But I knew there was something I had to be better at." She reached for his hand and squeezed it in a small, adult way. "You were better," she said. "You stayed." He held her hand and felt the simple truth of it. Staying was, in that moment, more than physical presence. It was the slow accretion of trust. Being the adult who answered calls, who sat through therapy sessions, who scheduled mornings around her school drop-off, who let her choose the length of her hair. It was the work of presence that turned absence into memory, and memory into a rebuilt life. Outside, the world continued to spin with its own stories and demands. Inside, a billionaire had remade his priorities, a child had reclaimed agency over her body and choices, and a household that was once staged for optics had learned to be ordinary and messy and healing in quieter ways. The case left wider ripples: changes in practices at charities, training programs for caregivers, a renewed conversation about power in private homes. But the central thing remained. A small person had been given, through slow and legal means, a safe place to grow. If you or someone you know needs help, reach out to local child protection services or trusted organizations that support children and families. Reporting suspicions early and connecting children with professionals can make a difference. If you can, support local programs that train caregivers, fund legal aid for families, or help create safe spaces for children to speak. Small actions, when combined, change the landscape that keeps children safe. In the end, the image that began the story, of a man returning from a life of deals to find his adopted daughter's hair cut by the woman who had presented herself to the world as a saint, remained a motif that had reoriented a life. It had been the point of fracture and the impetus for repair. The narrative did not pretend to polish away the past. It acknowledged scars and built rituals around them. Rafael kept the drawing in his wallet, and every night, before Sophia drifted to sleep, he said the words he had first offered on a breathless night so many years before. "I'm here." She answered with a sleepy, certain whisper that had become an anchor. "You are."